Our next speaker is Larry Maccherone from DevSecOps Transformation Contrast Security. Larry is a thought leader on DevSecOps. At Comcast, he launched and scaled DevSecOps transformation program over 5 years and is now at Contrast helping organizations empower development teams to make ownership of security. Larry was a founder director at Carnegie Mellon's Scilab and co-led the launch of Build Security Initiative. His topic for today is DevSecOps security at the speed of DevOps.
Hi, I'm Larry Maccherone. I'm here today to talk to you about how you can do security at the speed of DevOps. So what we see in the industry now is a trend called shift left. And this is not just a security trend. It's also a quality trend, which is great in my mind because I actually think of security as an attribute of quality. And this is a diagram from Devopedia that sort of talks to this problem, talks to this approach, I should say. Basically, you put more attention to quality and security earlier in the process. Unfortunately, though, a lot of times, security folks are just taking a traditional security concept that they were doing over on the right-hand side of this visualization, and then they're trying to sort of push it to the left without a lot of adaptation to actually make it be more appropriate. And so I refer to this as just putting DevOps lipstick on a traditional security pig. And the tool vendors do this as well. And I think of this more as shitting left than shifting left, to excuse my language there for a second. So you don't want to do that. And rather than do that, this is the definition I have of DevOps. And it's the same definition I have for DevSecOps, because I think if you're doing DevOps right, the security is essentially baked right in. And it's all about taking ownership. It's all about empowered engineering teams owning the quality and security of their products all the way to production. And that is essentially the message of DevOps is to break down the silos, get rid of the throw it over the wall, separate security specialists, maybe not get rid of them, but de-emphasize the need for that and shift more of the responsibility to be further left in the process. So a little bit about my background before I get into the meat of how you do this. I electrical computer engineering undergrad, started my first business. Our biggest client was GE Power Generation. So our software was involved in 60% of the world's power generation. If we had a vulnerability in that software, the bad guys could potentially bring down the world's power grid. So we got really good at producing essentially vulnerability-free software. So I packaged that up as a product I called Qualtrics and started selling that separately. The Carnegie Mellon folks sort of said, hey, this is a big thing. We want to introduce the world to a world-changing framework like yours. And so come to Carnegie Mellon and help us launch this thing called the Scilab, and you can help change the world with your framework. And so we launched this framework under the title Build Security In, with funding from the Department of Homeland Security. And the sad truth is that we failed. We fundamentally failed to change the world with the framework. This was 20 years ago or so, and it was too early. The security folks and the quality folks were separate silos back then. It was very hard to get development teams to take any level of ownership of the security. Now, along comes the Agile movement, which breaks down the quality silos to a certain degree. And then the DevOps movement, which break down the ops and the security silos to a certain degree. And so now we're sort of ready to do this. So the woman who helped me launch the Build Security Initiative at Carnegie Mellon, she was the CISO at Comcast, and she said, come to Comcast. This was at the beginning of the DevOps movement about 5 years ago, or I should say early in the DevOps movement, about 5 years ago. And let's launch the DevSecOps movement. And you can make Comcast be your pilot for that. And so over the course of the 5 years, I launched and scaled the DevSecOps transformation program at Comcast to the point where we had 600 development teams in the program at the end. One other thing to know about my background before I move on to the rest of the content is that I'm a developer. I am the primary author of a dozen or so open source projects, one of which gets almost 1 million downloads a month. Very active developer community around it. So I'm not just saying as a security expert, here's what you should do. I'm saying as a developer, as a coder, here's what I think you should be doing. I recently left my position at Comcast, and I'm now at Contrast Security, essentially doing the same thing I was doing at Comcast, except instead of just for the audience inside Comcast, I'm trying to spread this idea throughout the rest of the software development world. So this was the continuum, the infinity loop. You see a lot of these to represent sort of the DevOps cycle. I had this, many years ago, even before I went to Comcast. And when I got to Comcast, I started grafting over the top of it the practices from my Build Security initiative. And they grafted pretty well. It worked pretty nicely. I could pretty much find a spot for all of them in the continuum, which worked out pretty well. But what I found is that this was while this was a great tool for doing blog posts and getting Twitter followers, this image. It wasn't a great tool for actually getting development teams to adopt the practice. So I needed a different approach. And thankfully, I helped create a different approach to do agile transformation and DevOps transformation. And it's basically this framework that really consists of 3 main parts. First of all, it means using terminology and methodology and practices and tools that win the hearts and minds of developers. And then have a shallow team level improvement ramp, and then have an organizational wide improvement visibility so you can engage executives and set goals to accomplish what you want. So we're going to drill down to each of these parts in detail. And then at the end, I'm going to sort of wrap up with a couple of sort of sidebar things that are very important to this. So we've already seen this definition here, but the point of showing it again is really because I use this definition when I'm talking to development teams. Rather than say DevSecOps is something we want you to do for the security people, it's something that we think you're probably already thinking about because the DevOps movement calls for it. The book that launched the DevOps movement, the Phoenix Project, that starts with the security guy running around the building, basically complaining about things. So security is baked right into the idea of doing DevOps. And so if you're doing DevOps right, then you should be doing the security aspects of it as well. And so we're just trying to help you do that. And it shifts the conversation from, we want you to do this for us, to, we know you want to do this, we're just here to help you do it, which is great. Now, a lot of times I need to sell the value of DevOps to security people. And I do this with sort of like a very simple example here. Imagine a development team that is newly DevOps. And so they now care more about their product in production. And there's a security incident. So on a Saturday, they get called in to go deal with this security incident. And the developer spends all day, essentially, of his Saturday dealing with this. On Monday, he walks into his planning meeting, his normal sprint planning meeting that the team, even before they were DevOps, when they were just Agile, had every other week on a Monday. And he says to the team, guys, I had to spend my whole Saturday doing this. If I just had this one extra piece of information in the log, and if I just had this extra lever in the product to carve out the bad actors and let the good traffic go, I could have been in and out of there in 5 minutes. I could have done it from home without ever having to go in. Let's schedule those 2 things for this next sprint. We're going to add that logging information, and we're going to add that lever in the product. And someone else on the team notices, before we were DevOps, when we had a separate ops group, they've been asking for those same 2 things for 3 years now. But we never prioritized them because it wasn't our team's responsibility to take care of those things. So by expanding the ownership window to include things in production, you get fundamentally different decisions, more holistic decisions, better value decisions, rather than making a decision about what to work on in just the narrow sort of scope of we want to add functionality to the product. You get work done that increases the value overall to the client that may be quality or security related. This works, we've got plenty of studies that say dramatically faster time to market, happier customers, more revenue, 5 times lower rate of failure caused by changes, 96x faster recovery time from failures. And so the bottom line here is that you think of security and speed as something you trade off against each other. But the reality is that when, and the data really backs this up, is that when you're able to move faster, the things that you do that enable you to be able to move faster also enable dramatic improvements in quality and security. So you get both speed and quality and security. You don't have to trade them off against each other. And you have to stop thinking about them as trade-offs if you do it right. So another thing we use to sort of win the hearts and minds of developers, rather than just sort of talk to their DevOps vibe anyway, is we have this thing called the pledge that fundamentally changes our role in the process. And so the pledge starts off with this thing it starts off with the word trust. We trust that development teams are creating, evolving, and operating elegantly engineered, high quality, and high security software. And we know that you want to do that, and you're doing that to the best of your ability. We understand that you're close to the context, and sometimes you will have to make trade-off decisions. And sometimes that means incurring some technical debt, and that technical debt might be security debt. And that's a conscious decision that you're making. And we understand you understand the costs of that debt, and that you'll pay it down as quickly as possible so those costs don't swamp the value of having incurred the debt to get faster time to market. But we understand that that's the game you're playing, and we will play with you on that game. We will not force you to do things ahead of when they really make sense for your project to do them. But we're going to provide you feedback, coaching, and insight to ensure that you are informed about sort of the costs of that debt you're incurring. And we're going to, and this is a more important thing, is we're going to stop sort of saying you must. And rather, we're going to work on making the thing that you want to do, the right thing to do, be the easiest thing to do. And so things that used to be a burden to you, we're going to make it point and click, self-service, easy for you to get done and get on board. And our role fundamentally changes from those of being gatekeepers to production to being coaches and toolsmiths, so you can get to production quicker without us being in the way. So that's win the hearts and minds of developers. What about shallow level team improvement ramp? And so I have this very different maturity model, and I use a coaching approach to get development teams to do this. So let me talk about the maturity model first, or the levels of the maturity model, and then we'll talk about sort of how we use it. So I don't have an auditing mindset. So I'm not going to say you've been dinged, you get a red check X mark for this. There's no red, amber, green in my maturity model. It's all just, have you done it yet or not? And how well you've done it, how deeply you've adopted it is sort of a greening up of the scale. And so we go from not knowing how well you're doing a particular practice to thoughts, meaning you haven't really put much thought into it. Maybe today is the first time you're thinking about it because we're talking about it. To words, meaning we're making plans. We have a concrete plan to adopt this practice. To actions, meaning we've partially adopted it. Maybe we've got it for 2 of our 5 apps, or we've got this training for 50% of our developers. To culture, and culture is this darkest shade of green here. And when you get to culture, you're basically doing it for every possible opportunity that makes sense to do this. So you don't want to do certain practices for certain legacy apps because they rely on new DevOps tooling, and that legacy app maybe doesn't have that. So that would be excluded from it. So, but for every reasonable place where you could be doing this practice, you are doing it. And for all new stuff, you wouldn't think of doing it any other way. And so here's how we use that scale. We have a list of 40 or so practices, and please don't try to read the details of each of these practices, because this list is going to be custom for every organization. And of course, there's lots of places you can pull the candidates for this list, and I can help you customize a candidate list for you. But that doesn't really matter as so much as getting people to do the things you want them to do. So deciding what you want them to do first we'll leave as an exercise that happened before this point, and that's not the focus of this discussion. But at Comcast, we had a list of about 40 or so practices we thought were good for development teams under various contexts to do. And we organized them so that the most important ones, the biggest bang for the buck ones, were in the upper left-hand corner. And the things that are down to the right either had prerequisites up here, or were lower value, or were more effort, or were more advanced and maybe only applied in niche concepts. And so we want this table to turn green from this left-hand corner out. And so what we would do is we would basically gray out and hide most of this table. And we would just show the 6 practices in the upper left corner here. And we would start to talk to these with the development team. We'd ask them to give themselves an assessment. They would take it from this blue unknown state to, are you at the thoughts level, meaning you didn't even know about this practice really before today, or had really just maybe thought about it, but never really even talked about it as a group? Are you at the words, meaning you're making plans to do it level, or are you at the actions level, or are you at the culture level? And we start with just the 6 practices in the upper left-hand corner. If we find 2 or 3 that are not at culture in that upper left-hand corner, we don't even bother doing the gap analysis for the other 34 practices in the table. We just stop the gap analysis because these are the biggest bang for the buck ones. We could embarrass you and make you feel bad by going through the other 34 things and show you how awful you are. That doesn't do anyone any good. It's a waste of my time and it's frustrating for you. And instead, what we do is we immediately shift into planning mode. And so we say, well, what would it take for you to actually adopt these 6 practices or these 2 or 3 that you're not at culture for in the next 90 days? And we make the whole workshop, this first 90-minute workshop with the team, all about making a plan to get to culture for just these key 6 things. Or if they were already at culture for those 6, then we have the next 6. And if they were already at culture for those, then we have the next 10. And so we make it this sort of layers, a very gradual thing. And we just sort of help them to sort of focus on the things they could do now that would provide the biggest bang for the buck. And then we work with them over the next 90 days. The coaches work with them of the individual development team. And then we come back 90 days later and we update the plan. We update it to maybe move on to the next level of the most highest things. So what I'm doing here is I'm introducing a new role. So I have this role, DevSecOps, transformation coach, AppSec coach, whatever you want to call it, SDL, secure development lifecycle, or secure SDLC, if that's your phrase, whatever you want to call these folks. But the word coach is really key. And these folks are, by the way, this is my favorite coach of all time. He's Frank Beamer, Virginia Tech Hokies football. That's my alma mater coach here. So, but we want the coach to sort of be a role. And it frequently is not somebody who is a security specialist, although sometimes it is if they have the right sort of mindset naturally. Often I hire scrum masters. Those are the kinds of people that are used to coaching developers to change their process. And so those folks are usually the most suited. I teach them everything they need to know. And they don't really need to be taught much because it's all documented in a framework here that they can click on the details of each of these practices. So they're really just reading off the content that's in there and asking the team to noodle on what it would take for them to do it. So the coach really isn't, at first, doesn't really need to be a deep expert in cybersecurity, which makes hiring for this role a lot easier than you would think and a lot less expensive. So that's the first new role here. And then that's the shallow improvement ramp. Now we're moving on to management visibility and goal setting, part of the overall framework. And so while you're doing this workshop with individual development teams, you'll do them in pockets of your organization. And you'll end up having these evaluations, self-assessments, if you will, gap analysis for all the different development teams in your org. And you can render this radar visualization. I've open sourced this component, so you can actually use this exact component here to do this. And each arc here represents a single team's gap analysis for that particular practice. This is a secure coding training practice. And this is threat modeling practice. This is having SAST and IS or IS tools integrated into your pipeline. This is having a software composition analysis tool integrated into your pipeline, et cetera. So at a glance, you can see how green this is for a given part of the organization. So these are the 11 key practices that Comcast had in 2019. In 2020, we shifted to 6 key practices and then a secondary set of 6. So this visualization would either be just 6 pie slices or it would be 12 pie slices that we would focus on. And at a glance, you can see how well the organization is doing. And we would use this to drive the conversation with the executive that was over these 10 different development teams. So there's 10 arcs here in this thing. And so he can sort of say, well, who is the team that is all blue? Why have they not been part of the program yet? Oh, that's this team. Well, let me do an introduction and help you get going with that group. Well, why are we at like words and actions for these 2 practices? It looks like it was like that last month too. I mean, why can't we get people to the culture level very well for those 2 practices? Oh, well, let's talk about that. There's some organizational things you could do to make that easier. And so we use this to drive the executive conversation. And then we show their progress over time and we gamify this. This top line goes up when we identify new development teams and they're part of the organization. The white area catches up with the gray area when we do the initial workshop with the team. And then the green areas climb as the teams mature. And you want to see the slope of this line eventually reach this gray area at the top is the goal here. So those are the 3 parts of the 3-part framework: the hearts and minds, shallow team level improvement ramp, and management visibility and goal setting, engaging executive sponsorship, et cetera. I have a couple of sort of sidebar things that are really important that I want to talk about before we wrap up here. And that is that tools matter. So here's that same infinity loop we showed earlier. And I break the world of tools down a little differently than the analysts do. So the analysts do have a category called software composition analysis. I like to refer to that as analysis for the code you import. Basically, this is looking at dependencies, third-party libraries, usually open source. So sometimes this is called open source security, which is, I think, of a bit of a grab beyond really what it really is. I think software composition analysis is a better name. And I like my name the best, analysis for code imported. And so this is looking for CVEs, publicly reported vulnerabilities that are in the libraries that you're using. And the fix is really easy. You just have to upgrade to the version that doesn't have the vulnerability has been patched, essentially. You could refer to this as patching, but it's typically not a patch in the diffing sense. So I don't really like to sort of refer to it as patching. But a lot of security people still think of it as patching because you're really upgrading the specification of the dependency in the code. So you're not patching something that's in prod. So it's a very different way. And then the next time you build and deploy, you get the newer version. This can be hard if the new version that you have to upgrade to breaks your app. And so 95% of the time, it's easy. Just upgrade the version, run your tests, and if it passes, then redeploy and you're fixed. But that 5% of the time can actually be difficult. And you have to design your process to deal with the fact that 5% of the time it's going to be difficult to upgrade. Then you have what is traditionally referred to as static analysis or SAST tools. It's looking at the source code. It's looking for vulnerabilities that you wrote, like SQL injection kind of vulnerabilities. But there's actually a better tool that does the same thing called IAST. It's also looking for vulnerabilities in the code you write, but it's doing it with a more superior approach that eliminates a lot of the false positives. And so I like to refer to this collection of these 2 tools as analysis for code written. And I believe that if you're doing one or the other, you're good enough. You don't need to be doing both. And so this is difficult for a lot of security people who have been around for a while because SAST and static analysis have been talked about for 30, 40 years in the security world. And IAST is relatively new on the market. I work for an IAST vendor now, but this slide was created long before I worked for Contrast, because I believe that IAST is a superior tool approach to doing this. But it's not as there's certain criteria you have to meet before IAST really becomes easy to do. And so most of the time you have to, as an enterprise, support both approaches. But when you get more and more teams doing true DevOps, then you can sort of wind down your SAST usage and shift towards more IAST usage. People talk about DAST. And DAST is integral and has been around a long time and is a part of a lot of AppSec programs. I never actually implemented it at Comcast, because it doesn't fit well with the pipeline. And my program was really towards in-pipeline thing. Now, there's a few new DAST tools that are coming out, one of which Comcast is piloting now, that I helped get them sort of set up to pilot, that are more conducive towards being in the pipeline. And so that might change over time, but it's grayed out here as something I don't really focus on. Fuzzing is similar. Fuzzing is essentially like a particular type of DAST. The beauty of both DAST and fuzzing is you get essentially 0 false positives. If it finds something, it's got to be real because it was hitting the runtime app and it saw it in the behavior. Another tool category which competes with web application firewalls, which I don't show on here and I probably should, is runtime application security protection. And this is great for legacy apps. So the reason I now work for Contrast is essentially I figured I believe they have really the best vision of how to cover both legacy and new modern DevOps. Put RASP on your legacy apps and it will protect the application from being attacked, even if the vulnerabilities are still in there, because the legacy apps are not getting active development. It'd be harder to get them to use a true DevOps approach. So, it's not really reasonable to expect them to use a SaaS tool. And if they use a SaaS tool, it might find 100,000 things and they're never going to fix them. So, just put a RASP tool on there and it'll block the bad guys from actually being able to exploit those vulnerabilities. And then combine that with an IS tool that from DevOps teams that prevents that vulnerability from ever getting into production in the first place. It's the ideal combination is those two things, I think. And that's what Contrast has. And that's why I now work for Contrast. And this is the whole picture for you to take the slide away. The other sort of sidebar I want to talk about is the second role. So we talked about coaches being a new role. I want to talk about pipeline engineers, and you can put qualifiers around what kind of pipeline engineer here. But these folks are doing two things. They're the toolsmiths. They're going to make the easy thing to do be the right thing to do. They're going to create self-service, click here, get it done yourself kind of tools. You need developers doing this because tool creation is not just configuring things. You're not just configuring a pipeline. You're actually building things that go in the pipeline. And so that's code you have to write. And my development team at Comcast was very evolved and very mature doing this. Make sure that they're doing it in a robust DevOps way. What I find is that the security people think, oh, our developers are doing it the right way. But they're generally not. They're doing it sort of in the right way from a traditional waterfall security perspective, but they're not doing it in the right way from a DevSecOps perspective. And so you really have to have true DevOps practices. This team has to be really doing it in a true DevOps way and have them actually use all of the tools that you're asking development teams to do. I actually overloaded them with every tool and the new ones we were piloting. So the pipeline for the tools we were developing had not just one IaaS tool and a RASP tool. It had IaaS tool and 3 different SaaS tools and 2 different SCA tools. And so we were trying out all the tools before we asked development teams to do it. And we were doing it. And that gave us a lot of rich information about which tools were easier to use and which tools gave us better information and which ones had more false positives, et cetera. So have them dog food, not just the tools, but also the practices and policies you're going to be insisting that development teams use. This stopped a lot of false starts. Like some executive would have bought a tool and said, hey, or implemented a new policy and said, hey, you're talking to development teams. Can you get them to do this? And I would say, well, sure, but we have to try it out ourselves first. And we're like, it's really hard for us to do this because it assumes this waterfall concept that's no longer applies. So we can't really do that. Here's an alternative way. Can you adapt the policy or the practice or the tool to work in that way? And it really meant that anything that we were pushing hard on the development teams was really vetted very well to be conducive to doing it in the right way. Metrics also matter. We showed you one metric earlier. This is the primary visualization I use to drive a development behavior. This is a list of findings, essentially in a cumulative flow diagram. The top line goes up when new findings are found. The green line goes up when they're resolved. And then this blue area is false positives. And we use this to diagnose healthy tool behavior. We want to minimize this orange area. And if things are staying open a long time, or if this top line is going up faster than the green line is ever going to catch up with it, then that's an opportunity for coaching with the development team. And this drives really short median time to resolve numbers. I got to the point where we had less than a day median time to resolve numbers for a subset of the 600 development teams that were in the program. And all the other remaining development teams were targeting this 1 day median time to resolve for critical and high vulnerabilities that were found in the pipeline. I do have more metrics information in another talk I gave at the RSA conference last year. It shows you sort of which practices you need to adopt to get an 85% reduction in overall risk. This was sort of the summary slide of that talk. I'm not going to go into this now, but I'm going to reference you to that link down here at the bottom. I'll put it on the last page here. And then I did want to talk about one other sort of sidebar thing. We took all these metrics and we gamified the whole thing. We gamified it at the organizational level, so the executives were competing against each other. We gamified it at the team level so that the team score was, you showed the team what percentile they were compared to all the other sister teams, comparative teams, nobody wanted to be in the less than 50th percentile. So they would work harder at improving if they knew that they had a target for that. And then we had a leaderboard and all of that was sort of gamified. It really drives behavior when you gamify it. And here's my closing slide here. If you want to reach out to me, connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you have. I also can help you sort of launch a pilot program at your company that sort of uses this approach. And of course, here's the final link to the talk at the RSA conference that I referenced recently. Thank you, and I appreciate your time, and hopefully this was of use to you.